Okay, let's unpack this and dive deep. Today, we're taking on a truly massive topic, a sweeping journey through the history of Western philosophy.
Mm,
Our guide. Well, it's basically a stack of notes and texts drawn straight from Bertrand Russell's work on the subject.
right. And our mission in this deep dive really is to sift through all this material. We want to pull out the essential nuggets, the key takeaways, the surprising connections.
Those aha moments.
Exactly. Those aha moments that give you, our listener, a real shortcut to getting informed on the major shifts and ideas discussed here.
You often hear that what we call a modern philosophy, it really kicks off with Descartes, famously starting from the self. I think, therefore I am.
And that's definitely a key point in the story, no doubt. But what this material shows us is that the roots go vastly deeper, way back.
All the way back to the ancient Greek.
All the way back. And the threads of influence, they weave forward through the centuries, showing some, well, incredibly surprising links across different eras of thought.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Let's start right at the beginning of this story with some of those ancient roots and some truly intriguing ideas Russell highlights.
Right at the start, you see these hints of ideas that feel almost, I don't know, deeply spiritual, mystical even, cropping up in unexpected places.
Like what?
Well, Russell points to something called orphism.
Hmm.
And these fascinating finds in ancient tombs, these tablets, like the Petelia tablet,
Oh, yeah.
giving instructions to the soul,
Hmm.
like how to navigate the afterlife, prove its worthiness,
Whoa.
that sort of thing.
Wow, and the connection Russell draws here is, well, it's genuinely surprising. He notes that the Orphic idea of man being like a prisoner who shouldn't, open the door, meaning commit suicide,
Mhm.
is echoed almost word for word by Socrates in Plato's Phaedo.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it, how much influence these ancient religious currents had on the very foundations of philosophical thought, even on figures we think of as purely rational.
Okay, so moving from mystery cults to early Greek settlement. The material mentions Pythagoras. He apparently left Samos because he wasn't keen on the government there.
That's the story.
Hmm.
He set up shop in Croton in southern Italy. These were prosperous, pretty independent cities back then.
Right.
And there's this vivid detail about the rivalry with Sybaris, a city so famous for its luxury. I mean, its name is still proverbial today.
Sybaritic luxury.
Croton utterly destroyed it, 510 BC. But Croton itself, it had its own fame, particularly for medicine, interestingly enough.
And then we meet Heraclitus. Russell presents him as, well, less in that scientific vein of the early Milesian thinkers, more of a mystic figure.
A mystic, yeah, but a very unique one.
Yeah.
His core idea was that fire was the fundamental stuff, and everything is in constant change. The famous doctrine of everything in flux.
Right, you can't step into the same river twice.
Exactly. Yet he also saw this deep unity in opposites. That striking phrase, mortals are immortals and immortals are mortals. The one living the other's death and dying the other's life. Yeah, that's powerful.
It captures his vision of a universe where, apparent distinctions just dissolve into a fundamental unity, which he associated with, well, the divine.
That idea of constant flux, though, it creates a real problem for knowledge, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Especially when you think about someone like Parmenides, who argued for the exact opposite, a static, unchanging reality.
Absolutely. And Russell highlights that Parmenides' argument relies pretty heavily on a seemingly simple, but actually quite problematic assumption
Which is?
that words have a constant fixed meaning, always.
Ah. And he challenges this.
Yeah, with a really relatable example. Think about George Washington. If you met him back then, the name George Washington and I, for him, would have a direct, concrete meaning. The man standing there.
Sure.
But for us today, the meaning is completely different. It's memories, pictures, descriptions like the first president. The meaning isn't the man himself. It's tied up in our present experience, our history. So Russell's point is that the very starting block of Parmenides' argument that words hold their meaning unchangingly, it's shaky. Meanings shift.
They shift over time, depending on who's using them. Yeah.
Empedocles sounds like quite the character in this period. A real blend, philosopher, prophet, scientist, even a bit of a showman, claiming he was a god.
Oh, he was a fascinating figure. From Aquinas in Sicily, living through some intense political upheaval, constant battles between democracy and tyranny, leaders getting exiled, killed.
He got banished himself, didn't he?
He did. He's a great example of how intertwined philosophy, politics, and even sort of personal charisma were back then.
So after these early figures, the focus of Greek philosophy seems to shift, especially after Democritus. The material notes it moves from thinking about the cosmos to thinking about man.
Exactly. You see the rise of the sophists. They bring in skepticism about knowing the external world, and they turn philosophy inward to consider how we know things.
And then Socrates, whose focus was just squarely on ethics. He famously said, and it's quoted here from the Apology, "I have nothing to do with physical speculations."
Yes, his mission, especially in those early dialogues Plato wrote, was searching for definitions. What is temperance? What is friendship? Courage? And interestingly, Russell points out these dialogues often end without a clear answer. The search itself was the point.
This focus on the human condition, it leads directly to the dramatic climax of Socrates' life, his trial in 399 BC.
And the political backdrop was just crucial. Athens had just lost the war with Sparta.
Yeah.
And the Spartan-backed oligarchy, the 30 tyrants, and some of them were actually Socrates' students, including their leader Critias. They'd just been overthrown.
So the restored democracy was understandably pretty bitter, looking for scapegoats, maybe, even though there was technically an amnesty?
An amnesty that should have prevented revenge for past political actions.
Mm.
But Socrates was accused of charges that sort of bypassed it: impiety, not worshiping state gods, bringing in new ones, and corrupting the young.
And the prosecutors are named: Anytus, Miletus, Lycon.
Those are the ones mentioned, yeah.
Now, it's interesting how Russell reads the Socrates we get from Plato. He sees him as anticipating later philosophical schools.
Definitely. His famous argument in court that his judges can't truly harm him.
Right, because virtue is the only real good, and they can't take that away.
That strongly echoes the later Stoic doctrine, virtue as the sole good.
And his lifestyle. Simple, almost austere, going barefoot, not owning much. That seems to look forward to the cynics, right?
Yeah.
Despising worldly goods, rejecting comforts.
It really does. It suggests that while these schools came later, some of their core attitudes, their principles, were already embodied, or at least, portrayed in the figure of Socrates.
Speaking of Plato, Russell sees him as a true peak in philosophy. Immense, long-lasting influence, shaping everything from early Christianity, the medieval church, all the way to modern liberals, even the U.S. founders.
Huge influence. And Plutarch, too, his writings had a big impact, especially on figures like Lycurgus and that whole Spartan way of life.
And those details Russell pulls from Plutarch about Sparta are, well, they're stark.
Oh, absolutely. Homosexual relationships integrated into their education and military structure. Virtually no individual liberty people lived as if in a camp, totally dedicated to the state.
And leisure was only possible because the Helots, their enslaved population, did all the work.
That's the grim reality behind the ideal.
That Spartan ideal of absolute state service, it makes Plato's political philosophy, especially his idea of justice in the Republic, everyone doing their designated job, feel a bit less abstract. Maybe more tied to real-world models he admired, however extreme.
It does connect. But, as Russell points out, a major challenge for Plato's ideal state is, well, who decides what everyone's job is?
Right.
In his vision, it's the state, based on aptitudes. And the philosopher rulers, they have to agree with Plato and, crucially, allow no innovations.
Which raises that big question. Can a state that prohibits change actually remain just or wise? Seems unlikely.
Precisely. And this connects to Plato's famous theory of ideas or forms. The material uses the classic example, the bed.
Ah, the bed example.
Right. There are countless physical beds we see and use, but Plato argued there's only one true ideal idea or form of a bed, created by God in his telling.
And this ideal bed is the truly real one. The physical ones are just copies.
Exactly. Imperfect copies or shadows of this perfect form. We can have genuine knowledge of the ideal form, but only fleeting opinion about the physical copies we perceive through our senses.
This focus on eternal forms, it makes the philosopher a spectator of all time and all existence, someone kind of detached from the messy, changing world.
That detachment is central. The philosopher's role in Plato's system is focused squarely on that unchanging eternal realm of forms.
Let's circle back quickly to Socrates and death in the Phaedo. His view that suicide is unlawful because man is like a prisoner, or God's cattle that shouldn't just wander off.
Yeah, this philosophical stance against suicide, it's linked to his hope for the afterlife. His belief that he's going to be with wise and good gods and better people who've already died. His whole outlook on life and death is interwoven.
Russell also touches on that idea of separating soul from body, but he offers a critical insight. It's a mistake to equate virtue only with denying bodily pleasures.
Right. He argues that some of the worst pleasures aren't physical at all. Think about envy, cruelty, the love of power.
Good point.
He uses the really powerful example of Milton's Satan, who finds pleasure in destruction even after being physically tormented. True virtue, Russell suggests, is more about the state of the mind, the will, than just bodily asceticism.
Okay, going back to Heraclitus and flux, Russell connects that idea to the view that if knowledge is purely perception, then knowledge can only be of what is becoming, what's changing, not what is in a stable sense.
Yeah, and this highlights a fundamental challenge in philosophy, doesn't it? If the world is constantly flowing, how can we possibly have stable knowledge about it?
The material mentions some simple-sounding logical puzzles that apparently stumped philosophers for centuries, right up to Hegel.
Yeah, things like how the number 6 can be both great compared to 4 and small compared to 12 at the same time.
Or how Socrates can be called tall at one point and short relative to someone else.
These are examples of difficulties with what we call relational propositions, statements about how things relate to each other, not just their own qualities. Traditional subject-predicate logic really struggled with these.
And Russell emphasizes a key point here. For any meaningful discussion or knowledge to even be possible, words need to have meanings that are fixed, at least for a time, even in a world of change.
That stability, however temporary, is crucial. If the meaning of apple changed every second, we couldn't even say there's an apple on the table.
Plato clearly preferred stability over that Heraclitean flux. Russell notes Plato's great respect for Parmenides, calls him a reverend and awful figure. But interestingly, Plato kind of refuses to engage directly with Parmenides' core argument in one dialogue. It shows his philosophical preference, maybe, for a static universe of forms.
It's a revealing sidestep, yeah. Shows his priorities in building his own system.
Russell also brings in math and logic as forms of knowledge not derived from sensory perception, using the word two as an example.
Right. Two refers to the abstract form, the idea of two-ness, not a physical thing like the redness of an apple.
And Russell's analysis here, as the material sums it up, is that while Plato's arguments against other kinds of knowledge being reliable are, valid,
they don't necessarily prove his conclusion that knowledge as a forms is true, just that his reasons might not be totally sound.
Interesting distinction.
It is. It separates the critique from the proposed alternative.
Okay, finally, in this ancient section, we touch on Pythagoras' famous statement, man is the measure of all things.
Right. And the key clarification Russell provides is that this means each man is the measure, specifically of their own perceptions.
So it's deeply subjective.
Totally. It's a doctrine that leads directly to a pretty radical subjectivism. Truth becomes relative to the individual observer.
Okay, quite a foundation laid. Let's move forward now into the medieval period and tackle a giant figure who built heavily on those ancient foundations, Aristotle.
Yeah, Aristotle. And Russell starts this section with a pretty sharp critique of some very fundamental Aristotelian concepts: substance and essence.
What's the critique?
He argues they're really just linguistic ideas, conveniences for talking about things. And they got mistakenly transferred into metaphysics as if they were real features of the world itself.
He uses the example of Socrates, right? Arguing he isn't some solid thing underneath everything.
Exactly. He is the collection of events happening to him. You can't really separate Socrates, the substance, from the fact that he's doing things, experiencing things, living his life.
That's quite insightful. It challenges how we intuitively think about objects as static things. Russell suggests it's more about how our language works.
Than about the fundamental nature of reality itself, yeah. It's a linguistic lens.
Aristotle also introduced that crucial distinction between form and matter.
He did, using simple examples. For a marble statue, marble is the matter. The shape is the form.
Bronze sphere. Bronze is matter. Sphericity is form.
Calm sea. Water is matter. Smoothness is the form. The form is what makes something the kind of thing it is.
He also classified substances, creating a sort of hierarchy.
Right. Perishable ones like plants and animals. Sensible but not perishable ones like heavenly bodies, the sun, stars, and then those neither sensible nor perishable. The rational soul and, ultimately, God.
And this classification leads straight to his argument for God as the first cause.
It does.
How did he get there again?
Well, he reasoned there must be something that initiates motion in the universe but isn't itself moved by anything else, an unmoved mover.
Okay.
He saw this first cause as eternal substance, pure actuality. And here's the really unique part. It causes motion not by pushing things, like other causes.
For how then?
By being the ultimate object of desire and thought. It causes motion simply by being loved, by being the perfection that everything else strives towards.
So, God is pure thought, the ultimate beloved, moving the universe just by existing as perfection. That's quite a concept.
It is pure eternal thought. And as thinkers like Aquinas would later elaborate, based on Aristotle, creatures differ from God always by some kind of negation. They lack something God has perfectly. They aren't pure actuality, not eternal in the same way.
Russell also touches on Aristotle's ethics and politics, specifically that long-running debate. Is the social good just the sum of individual goods, or does the state, the community, have its own goods separate from the individuals in it?
Right. He notes that some later philosophers, especially German idealists like Hegel, really leaned into the idea that ethical goodness belongs primarily to the state. Individuals are good only by participating in it.
But Russell says that wasn't quite Aristotle's view.
Not entirely, he suggests. While Aristotle saw justice in relation to the state, his overall view wasn't usually that extreme, except maybe on that specific point about justice itself.
Aristotle was certainly no champion of equality, though. Supported slavery, the subjection of women.
Definitely not. And in his political theory, he argued against political equality for all citizens. He had his idea that the worst crimes come from excess, not just from need. People don't become tyrants just to avoid being coals, for instance.
He classified governments based on the moral quality of the rulers, didn't he?
Yes. Monarchy, aristocracy, and polity were the good forms ruled by one, the best, or the many for the common good.
And the bad forms were tyranny, oligarchy, democracy rule for the ruler's own benefit.
Exactly. He saw virtue and the golden mean as key. He distinguished aristocracy rule by the virtuous from oligarchy, which was just ruled by the rich.
And Russell briefly mentions Aristotle's huge contribution to logic with the syllogism.
Foundational work. Laid the groundwork for formal reasoning for centuries.
Okay, moving beyond Aristotle, Russell describes a big shift in philosophy during the Hellenistic period. This is after the independent Greeks, city-states lost power to bigger empires, Alexander's, then Rome.
Right. And with the decline of the city-state as the main focus of life and identity, philosophy turned inward.
The central question changed.
It really did. From how do we build a good society to something more like how can I as an individual be virtuous or maybe just happy in a world that seems flawed, full of suffering.
Leading to a much more subjective, individualistic outlook.
You really see this with the cynics. Antisthenes, for example, thought abstract philosophy was pointless. Famously said he'd rather be mad than delighted by it.
And his follower Diogenes, the one who supposedly lived in a tub.
That's him.
Yeah.
His aim was to deface the coinage, basically. Reject all social conventions, all traditional values, live according to nature as he saw it.
Then there's Epicurus. His philosophy often gets caricatured as just seeking pleasure, right?
It does. But Russell highlights his earnestness, even a kind of religious devotion within his community. He called it our holy body. His main goal was actually to lessen human suffering.
And a key part of that was removing fear. Fear of death, fear of the gods' anger.
Precisely. Russell speculates his non-aristocratic background might have fueled his strong stance against conventional religion and superstition. It's a different picture, closer to a kind of therapeutic reformer seeking peace of mind than just a hedonist.
Stoicism offered another path for navigating a difficult world. Their central idea, virtue is the sole good.
Yes, but as Russell points out, this created some logical knots. How could a benevolent God or providence allow evil and sin?
Right.
And if virtue is the only good, then wouldn't things like cruelty or injustice, which give you opportunities to be virtuous by enduring them, also have to be seen as somehow good? It gets complicated. Determinism was another tricky issue for their emphasis on virtuous choice.
Chrysippus is highlighted as a key Stoic figure, believed the good man was always happy like God.
Yes, and he was also more interested in theoretical studies, logic especially, made logic fundamental.
And the Stoics made real contributions to logic and grammar.
They did. Chrysippus's broader academic interest might be why many Stoics went on to make advances in science and math too, beyond just ethics.
Later Stoicism evolved a bit. Figures like Panaetius brought in Platonic ideas, moved away from materialism.
And Posidonius, a Syrian Greek who traveled really widely, experienced anarchy, saw the sunset in the Atlantic. These later figures show Stoicism adapting, spreading through the Roman world.
Russell brings up the Antonine period, often called a golden age by historians like Gibbon, but he offers a more critical take.
He does. He points out the immense suffering hidden beneath the surface slavery, those incredibly cruel public spectacles. The economy wasn't great, initiative was stifled, really residing only with the emperor.
And the cultural tone was often backward-looking, even tired.
Yeah, you can sort of sense that in Marcus Aurelius's writings, despite his wisdom. It's a contrast to more obviously hopeful periods like the Enlightenment, and the Stoic ethic itself focused on endurance.
It was maybe particularly suited to an age where progress seemed difficult or out of reach.
Perhaps. It fit the times. Looking at the bigger picture, that shift in philosophy from the collective, the city, to the individual's inner resilience seems like a direct response to living in these huge, often impersonal empires.
Russell makes a crucial historical note about Alexander the Great and Rome preserving Greek culture.
It's a vital point. Their conquest could have wiped out Greek civilization, but they were actually Philhellenes, lovers of Greek culture.
They admired it.
They admired it, preserved it. Art, literature, science, philosophy. Without that, Russell argues, it might have been lost entirely during the West's so-called Dark Ages.
And the Arabs played a critical role later in keeping that flame alive.
Absolutely essential. When learning declined in Western Europe, Arab scholars were busy preserving, translating, and actively studying Greek philosophy, especially Aristotle.
Their centers of learning, like in Spain.
Acted as a bridge. They reintroduced Aristotle to the West, sparking the revival of learning that led to scholasticism. It wasn't until much later, really from the 13th century, that the West started studying Greek texts directly again in a big way. But the groundwork was laid by Arab scholarship.
They made the West aware of what had been lost, or at least neglected.
Exactly. Aware of the intellectual treasures waiting to be rediscovered.
Now, in the face of the decline of the Roman world, Plotinus and the Neoplatonists turned inward again, contemplating an eternal world of goodness and beauty as an escape from worldly ruin.
Yes, a turn towards the transcendent. And this philosophy had a profound influence on the development of Christian theology. Plotinus described a kind of trinity, the one emanating into nous, or divine intellect,
Which then emanates into soul.
which in turn generates the material, the sense world, as the lowest sphere of reality. But importantly, he still saw the physical world as beautiful, just less perfect than the higher realms.
Which set him apart from some other mystical groups, like the Gnostics, who saw the material world and its creator as fundamentally evil.
Right. Neoplatonism provided a philosophical framework that many early Christian thinkers found really useful for understanding God, the soul, and the spiritual realm.
Russell presents Christianity itself not just as a unique revelation, but as a fascinating synthesis.
Yes, a blend. Philosophical ideas, especially from Plato, the Neoplatonists, the Stoics, Jewish history, morality, prophecy, and maybe some new salvation theories, drawing on earlier mystical traditions from Orphism to Near Eastern cults.
The Jewish elements highlighted include that fierce national pride, a belief in their unique importance, and the conviction that their misfortunes were God's punishment.
Right. And Russell makes an interesting observation about the Old Testament prophets. He sees them as innovators, pushing for higher ethical standards rather than just trying to restore some lost earlier strictness.
The transmission of the Bible itself is part of this story. Russell mentions the legend versus the reality of the Septuagint translation, and how Jerome's Latin Vulgate became the authoritative text for the Catholic Church, despite initial controversies, including accusations that Jews had altered texts relating to Christ.
This whole process really highlights how foundational religious texts are formed and gain authority over time. It involves translation, interpretation, and sometimes, conflict.
The material introduces key church fathers who were hugely influential in shaping Christian doctrine and the church's role: Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustine.
Ambrose laid groundwork for the church's relationship with secular power. Jerome gave the West its standard Latin Bible and promoted monasticism. And Augustine, well, perhaps the most important, he fixed much of Christian theology right up until the Reformation, influencing figures like Luther and Calvin massively.
Augustine famously argued against groups like the Manichaeans that evil wasn't a separate substance or force,
But came from a perversion of the will, a turning away from God.
and his great work, The City of God, initially a response to pagans blaming Christianity for the sack of Rome.
It evolved into this complete Christian philosophy of history, incredibly influential in the Middle Ages, especially in those power struggles between the church, the city of God, and secular rulers, the city of man.
Augustine held Plato in very high regard, didn't he? Saw him as the greatest philosopher, closest to Christian truth.
Yeah, not materialistic, understood perception wasn't the source of real truth. He saw Aristotle as inferior to Plato, but still far above everyone else. Interestingly, Russell notes that Augustine thought both Plato and Aristotle saw all gods as good and worthy of worship.
Monasticism gets a mention with that anecdote about St. Benedict giving up his studies because he saw other students living dissolute lives.
Gaining what's described as learned ignorance and furnished with unlearned wisdom.
Yeah, that captures the early church's complex relationship with classical pagan learning, sometimes embracing it, sometimes deeply wary of it.
It was a tension, definitely.
This brings us squarely to the long power struggle between the church and secular rulers. Russell touches on Pope Gregory the Great's relationship with the emperor, showing deference, but also asserting conditional authority, even flattering a usurper when it suited the church.
Politics. Even then, the Franks played a key role allying with the popes against the Lombards. This led to that decisive bargain between Pepin and Pope Stephen III.
The pope legitimized Pepin as king.
And Pepin granted the Pope land, the Papal States, effectively severing the papacy's political ties to the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople.
And Charlemagne's coronation by the pope further cemented this new dynamic in the West. Russell notes the church's gains, like converting England and Germany, were actually more enduring than the fragile remnants of the Western Empire.
True. But what proved ultimately more significant, Russell suggests, was the rise of those free Italian cities, successfully resisting the Holy Roman emperors like Barbarossa.
Because that independence allowed for something new.
Exactly. The development of a vibrant, non-clerical culture, later on literature, art, science, paving the way for the Renaissance. The famous terms Guelph and Ghibelline actually come from this conflict between papal and imperial factions in Italy.
There's a specific example of this tension, the clash between Pope Gregory the X and Emperor Frederick II over the Crusade.
Right. Frederick, despite being excommunicated by the Pope, went on crusade anyway, and then he successfully negotiated a peaceful return of Jerusalem from the Muslims.
Which infuriated the Pope.
Deeply. It wasn't the expected way of doing things.
This leads us to scholasticism, dominated by Thomas Aquinas. Considered the greatest philosopher of the Middle Ages, his system is still mandatory in Catholic philosophy education today, isn't it?
It is since 1879. His work cemented Aristotle's dominance in Christian thought right up until the Renaissance. As Russell notes, while you could be a faithful Catholic and, say, a Cartesian philosopher later, engaging seriously with philosophy within the church framework often requires accepting Aquinas' system as the benchmark.
Russell touches on some of Aquinas' complex theological ideas about God, understanding many things through the single divine essence and word.
And the idea that creatures differ from God always by some form of negation. They lack something God possesses perfectly. Highly abstract, intricate philosophical theology.
Russell also notes the eclipse of the papacy later in the Middle Ages and suggests the 13th century synthesis of beliefs also incorporated elements from Eastern religions, dying gods, rituals, priesthood, dualism.
It shows how medieval belief was this complex tapestry, woven from many threads beyond just Greek and Jewish traditions.
And we get that dramatic and rather dark story of the Avignon papacy and the joint campaign by Pope Clement V and King Philip V of France against the Knights Templar.
Driven largely by a need for money, it seems, they accused the Templars of heresy, confessions were extracted under torture, their property confiscated.
And Russell, referencing historical research like Leah's work, concludes the charges were almost certainly unfounded.
That's the conclusion presented. A stark historical example of power and financial motives overriding justice and truth.
Okay, quite a tour through the medieval period. Let's cross the threshold now into what Russell calls the modern period. He outlines its key characteristics.
Yeah, a whole different landscape emerges. The church's authority diminishes, science's authority increases, you get lay culture growing outside the church.
States replace the church as the main organizing principle of life. Political shifts, monarchies giving way to democracies, or sometimes new tyrannies.
The decline of the feudal aristocracy, the rise of alliances between kings and merchants, eventually leading towards modern democracy and also socialism. These are the big currents.
We start with Machiavelli. Situated in Renaissance Italy, a period ending dramatically with the sack of Rome.
Right, and Machiavelli's famous work, The Prince, it's just a brutally pragmatic look at power, how principalities are won, held, lost.
Russell notes the kinds of cruelties and treacheries accepted then were different.
But he also suggests our own age, with its own political realities, might find Machiavelli's methods surprisingly understandable, maybe even appreciated in a grim sort of way. He points to Cesar Borgia, who Machiavelli holds up as an example to imitate.
There's that particularly interesting chapter in The Prince about ecclesiastical principalities. Russell suggests Machiavelli was probably hiding his true thoughts there. To please the Medici Pope he wanted favor from.
Seems likely. He claims these principalities are held by ancient customs and higher causes, making it presumptuous to discuss them.
But then immediately proceeds to analyze how Pope Alexander VI increased his temporal power.
Classic Machiavelli, appearing deferential while still dissecting the real politic behind the supposed divine right. Very shrewd.
The Reformation is obviously a huge event in this period. Erasmus is discussed in that context, criticized the church's own uses with satire.
But was ultimately put off by Luther's violence and hatred. His defense of free will against Luther's predestination provoked a notoriously savage reply from Luther.
Russell notes Erasmus became less important over time, maybe too cautious for an age of fierce belief.
Perhaps too intellectual, too nuanced for an age increasingly defined by heroism and intolerance. His comment on Thomas More's martyrdom is mentioned, comparing it sadly to actions of a devout but perhaps misguided emperor.
The conflict between new scientific discoveries, like Copernicus's astronomy, and religious authority, that's a defining tension of the early modern era.
Absolutely. Russell highlights the reaction from religious leaders. Both Luther and Calvin, despite their other huge differences, were equally resistant to Copernicus, based on their reading of Scripture.
Luther called him an upstart astrologer.
Yeah, and Calvin famously asked, who would dare place Copernicus's authority above the Holy Spirit's word that the world is fixed, established?
And it wasn't just Protestant leaders. Russell notes bigotry from both Protestant and Catholic clergy resisting findings that challenged established dogma.
It really underscores that broader conflict between different sources of authority. Religious revelation versus empirical observation and mathematical reasoning, a clash of worldviews.
Francis Bacon is presented as the great champion of the experimental method, induction, rejecting reliance on old deductive logic and tradition, the idols, as he called them.
He passionately advocated for observing nature directly, gathering data. Russell points out, though, that Bacon, while revolutionary in emphasizing empiricism, did kind of underestimate the crucial role of mathematics in the new science.
And a key problem Bacon faced with induction generalizing from observed instances, simple enumeration, Russell says remains unsolved in philosophy of science.
Largely, yes. He mentions later attempts like Mill's canons, but notes the fundamental logical justification for relying on comprehensive inductions is still seen as profoundly unsatisfactory by many. How do we logically justify that leap from some to all?
It's a persistent challenge.
Definitely.
Now, we arrive at Descartes, often marked as the beginning of modern philosophy. Russell highlights his caution, his timidity even.
Right. He held back from publishing his work, Le Monde, because it contained ideas considered heretical, the Earth's movement, the affinity of the universe, ideas Galileo was condemned for.
He was a devout Catholic, but clearly aware of the dangers.
Very aware.
Descartes' foundational move was his famous, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, making the existence of one's own mind the most certain starting point, more certain than the physical world.
And Russell argues this decision kicked off a strong tendency towards subjectivism in philosophy that's continued ever since. The idea that our own consciousness is the most immediate, reliable reality.
But Russell notes that while modern philosophy engages deeply with the problems Descartes raised,
it often rejects his specific solutions. The legacy is more in the questions than the answers.
Leibniz is introduced next, a figure of supreme intellect, though Russell notes his personal life was maybe less admirable. He had a kind of split philosophical personality.
Yes, exactly. There was his public philosophy, optimistic, almost fantastical, the source of that idea that this is the best of all possible worlds.
Parodied in Voltaire's Dr. Pangloss.
Right. But then he had this deeper private system found in his manuscripts after his death. Russell sees this as more profound, more logical, and actually much closer to Spinoza's ideas, more deterministic.
And his private philosophy used logic as a guide to metaphysics, inferring things about the real world from the structure of language or logic.
Yes, drawing inferences from syntax to reality. But Russell points out this method is now largely discredited, partly due to later empiricism and partly because the subject-predicate logic Leibniz relied on is seen as flawed, inadequate for dealing with relations.
And Russell argues Leibniz was inconsistent, trying to combine that logic with his pluralistic view of many monads.
Because the statement, there are many monads, isn't itself a simple subject-predicate statement. It expresses a relation or a quantity, which that old logic struggled with.
Okay, shifting towards political philosophy. Liberalism is introduced, with John Locke giving its first comprehensive statement.
Right, and Russell highlights Locke's huge influence. both clarifying liberal thought in England, but also acting as a revolutionary spark when his ideas were transplanted to France.
An example of how ideas can be more potent in new soil.
Exactly. Russell suggests that's often the case. Ideas transplanted to less prepared ground can have a more explosive effect.
Locke's political theory centered on property preservation as a main reason people form governments.
Yes. Though Russell finds parts of Locke's state of nature and natural law theory a bit puzzling, like the implied right a person has to shoot even a petty thief who just threatens their property, seeing it as an act of war, seems extreme.
And while Locke advocated for checks and balances to limit the king,
English political practice actually evolved differently. The government, parliament, effectively became both legislative and executive, contrary to Locke's principles. Shows how theory and practice can diverge.
then David Hume, presented as a major figure who took empiricism to its logical and perhaps uncomfortable conclusion, reaching ideas Russell calls incredible yet hard to refute, a philosophical dead end.
That's the description. Hume radically challenged fundamental concepts, like substance. He didn't see mind or matter as underlying things.
But just as collections or bundles of events, perceptions?
Exactly. And on perception itself, while he agreed we perceive things in time and space, he famously argued we never perceive causal relations directly
We just see one event follow another repeatedly.
and infer a connection,
Yeah.
habitually. But the necessary causal link itself isn't something we empirically observe.
This became a huge philosophical debate, right? Is causation real or just in our heads?
Basically, yes. Russell frames it as a controversy about empirical fact that's surprisingly hard to settle. What exactly do we perceive?
Okay, stepping into the 19th century, Russell describes it as intellectually much more complex than previous eras.
Yeah, several reasons. Wider geographical scope philosophy burgeoning in America, Russia, interest in India, huge new scientific breakthroughs, geology, biology, chemistry changing the game.
The massive social impact of machine production, industrialization.
And this profound intellectual revolt against tradition, taking both romantic and rationalistic forms. Lots going on.
Charles Darwin is highlighted as pivotal for the 19th century, like Galileo and Newton were for the 17th.
Right. Russell notes the idea of evolution itself wasn't totally new. Lamarck, Erasmus Darwin had ideas.
But Charles Darwin.
He provided the massive empirical evidence, and crucially, the mechanism natural selection, which gave the theory its immense popularity and explanatory force. That was the game changer.
Briefly, Hegel is touched upon. His complex idea that reason is the conscious certainty of being all reality. Reality is a process of thought.
Yes, culminating in the absolute idea as pure, self-thinking thought, a vast, rational, spiritual system developing dialectically through conflict. Very influential, very dense.
Among the Romantic philosophers, Russell focuses on Nietzsche, his ethics centered on the will to power, his fierce anti-Christian views.
Right. He contrasts Nietzsche's idea of the godlike great man with the more traditional Titan figure you find in Byron.
Nietzsche saw ordinary people as bungled and botched.
Pretty much. He didn't object to their suffering if it was necessary to produce a truly great individual, like Napoleon, who he saw as justifying the French Revolution and nationalism. A harsh philosophy.
Schopenhauer is another figure shaped by Romanticism. Admired Greek and Indian thought, disliked Hebraic Christianity.
Yes. He adapted Kant's philosophy, kept the thing in itself, but identified it purely as will, seeing the physical body as just the appearance, the phenomenon of this underlying will.
Russell shares some biographical details. Old bachelor, poodle named Atma, read the Times.
Long quest for fame, had busts of both Kant and Buddha. Adds a human touch.
Karl Marx's philosophy of history is fitted into that Hegelian dialectical mold. Feudalism leads to capitalism, which inevitably leads to socialism.
But instead of Hegel's nations or ideas clashing, for Marx, the conflict is driven by economic classes.
Russell notes Marx presented this not on ethical grounds, but as a deterministic scientific prediction.
Right. He disclaimed ethical motives. But Russell suggests Marx's underlying belief that socialism would increase human happiness, and his occasional calls for revolution betray the emotional and ethical basis beneath the scientific veneer.
Okay, moving into the early 20th century seeds. Russell discusses Henri Bergson, intuition, freedom, action.
Bergson argued against determinism. He thought philosophers made a mistake by treating psychological states like fixed things, or confusing lived duration la durée with abstract clock time.
For Bergson, true freedom comes from
Actions that spring from your whole indivisible personality, not just isolated motives, but the entire self in flow.
But Russell critiques Bergson, points out a confusion between subjective experience and objective reality.
Yeah, arguing it could lead to absurd conclusions. Like saying your friend Jones is literally inside your head or the Campanile Tower is inside you just because you perceive them, blurring the lines too much.
William James and pragmatism are introduced next, seen as developing from James's earlier will to believe.
Right. James and later John Dewey offer this pragmatic definition of truth. Something is true if it works, if its consequences are good. Especially useful, they thought, in areas like religion and morals where proof is hard to come by.
Russell outlines the intellectual difficulties here. How can you know what's good and know all the future consequences before you can even say if something is true?
It seems circular. He uses that complicated example. Is it true Columbus discovered America in 1492? For a pragmatist, deciding the truth involves evaluating the consequences of believing it versus believing 1491 or 1493 and then ethically judging those consequences seems unwieldy.
John Dewey has mentioned, too, his view that facts aren't necessarily stubborn, independent things. They can be shaped by human activity.
Yeah, that they might be influenced by our purposes and perspectives. Russell suggests this represents a potential shift in what common sense itself might become. Are facts out there or partly made?
And to bring this whole journey to a close, Russell draws a sharp contrast between Dewey's view of truth and his own.
Right. For Dewey, truth, or warranted assertability, as he preferred, is about future consequences, how a belief might enlarge human power, help us cope or achieve things.
Whereas Russell sees truth as grounded in the past.
Exactly. Grounded in past causes, which Russell feels places limits on human power. We can't just make something true because it would be useful or empowering tomorrow.
He uses the example of Caesar crossing the Rubicon. For Russell, the truth of that is fixed by a past event, unalterable.
But for Dewey, Russell argues, deciding whether it's true to assert Caesar crossed might depend on assessing the future consequences of making that assertion.
Russell pushes this to an extreme, suggesting that with enough power, enough control over society,
One could theoretically create an environment where asserting Caesar didn't cross the Rubicon would have warranted assertability, because believing otherwise leads to bad consequences in that controlled future. It's a disturbing endpoint to that line of thought for Russell.
wow, what a journey indeed. We've spanned millennia. From ancient mystical instructions, debates about flux, through Plato, Aristotle, the inward turn of Hellenistic thought.
The complex synthesis of Christianity, the clashes of church and state, the dawn of modern science challenging authority, Descartes, Hume turning philosophy on its head.
The vast intellectual landscape of the 19th century, Darwin, Nietzsche, Marx, all the way to early 20th century pragmatism with James and Dewey. Whew.
We've really tried to extract the core ideas, the significant shifts, and some surprising connections presented in this material, guiding you, the listener, through this incredible sweep of Western thought.
So here's something to maybe mull over as you reflect on this deep dive. We've seen dramatically different ideas about what truth even is throughout this history. From Plato's eternal, unchanging forms to Descartes' certainty found inside the mind, to Hume's view based only on empirical perception and inference.
And finally, that modern pragmatic view where truth might be linked to future consequences, utility, what works.
This evolution of the very idea of truth, it raises a crucial question for you today. How does understanding this complex, changing history of the concept of truth, how does that challenge your own assumptions about what it means for something to be true?
Yeah, how do you navigate the world, the information you encounter daily, knowing that even this fundamental concept has been understood in such profoundly different ways across time? It's something to think about.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.